Before I start the video, I want to say that a lot of people watch my videos without a subscription. If my content resonates with you, you could subscribe to the channel. Thus YouTube would promote it more, which in turn would motivate me to release and improve content more often. Thank you. Growing up in a rough neighborhood wasn't easy, especially for a child with anxiety like me. Every night, I would hear screams, gunshots, and fights. It felt like we were living in a war zone. My family and I always kept to ourselves, and we never really talked to our neighbors because we didn't know who we could trust. One night, when I was around 10 years old, my dad was on a business trip, and my mom, my two siblings, and I were alone in the house. It was midnight when someone started knocking on our door. My mom went to answer it, but there was no one there. She thought it might have been some kids playing a prank, so she went back to bed. A few minutes later, the knocking started again. This time my mom looked out of the window, but she couldn't see anyone. She started to get worried, so she went back to the bedroom, grabbed my dad's double-barrel shotgun, and waited in the living room. The knocking continued, and my mom started to shout that she was going to call the cops, and that she would shoot anyone who tried to come in. Finally, around 2:00 a.m., the police arrived. They searched around the house and found a piece of barbed wire next to the front door. They told my mom that whoever was knocking was planning on strangling her with it. The cops also found footprints leading to the back of the house and up to my bedroom window. They suspected it was one of our neighbors who had been staring at my mom through his curtains and knew when my dad wasn't home. We moved out of that house the next day, and my anxiety only got worse. I couldn't sleep at night, and I always felt like someone was watching me. I was scared to leave the house and would only go outside when my dad was with me. Years went by, and we moved to a better neighborhood, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I would often wonder if the person who had tried to break into our house was still out there, and if they would come after us again. Eventually, I started seeing a therapist, and it helped me a lot. I learned how to cope with my anxiety and how to deal with my fear of the unknown. I realized that I couldn't live my life in constant fear, and that I needed to let go of the past. Now, as an adult, I still have anxiety, but I'm much better at managing it. I've learned to trust people again and to open up to others. I know that I can't control what happens in life, but I can control how I react to it. In the end, that terrifying night made me stronger. It taught me that I'm capable of surviving even the scariest situations, and that I have the strength to overcome my fears. As I walked through the door of my new house, I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. It was a fresh start for me in a new neighborhood, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been creeping up on me since I had signed the lease. It wasn't until a few days later that I realized why. I was sitting in my living room, enjoying a cup of tea and watching some TV, when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look, but there was nothing there. I brushed it off as my imagination and went back to my show. But the next day, it happened again. This time, I was sure I saw someone peeking through my window. I jumped up from the couch and ran to the door, but when I opened it, there was nobody there. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. It was then that I realized that I had a neighbor who was spying on me. Every time I left my house, I would catch him trying to hide behind his door. I didn't understand why he did it, and it made my anxiety worse. I started to feel like I couldn't even relax in my own home. I didn't know what to do. The situation continued for weeks, and I became more and more paranoid. I started to feel like my neighbor was watching my every move, even when I was inside my house. It was all consuming, and I couldn't wait to move out. One day, I decided to confront my neighbor. I knocked on his door, and when he answered, I asked him why he was spying on me. He looked shocked and denied it, but I knew that he was lying. I couldn't take it anymore, so I told him that I was going to call the police. I thought that would be the end of it, but the next day, something strange happened. My neighbor knocked on my door and asked to come in. I was hesitant, but I let him in anyway. He told me that he was sorry for spying on me and that he had been going through a rough time. He said that he didn't have any friends or family nearby and that he had been feeling lonely. I listened to him, and even though I was still a bit worried, I started to feel sorry for him. We talked for a while, and by the end of the conversation, I felt like I had a new friend. We even made plans to hang out sometime. From that day on, things were different. I didn't feel like my neighbor was spying on me anymore, and I didn't feel as anxious as I had before. I still couldn't wait to move out, but now it wasn't because of my neighbor. It was because I had outgrown the house and was ready for a new adventure. A few weeks later, I packed up my things and said goodbye to my neighbor. He wished me well, and I knew that I would miss him. As I drove away from the house, I felt a sense of relief and excitement for what was to come. My anxiety was still there, but it was more manageable now that I had faced my fears and made a new friend. In the end, I learned that sometimes the things that scare us the most are just a product of our own imagination. And sometimes the people we think are our enemies can turn out to be our friends. All we have to do is take a chance and open ourselves up to new possibilities. I never expected that my night of celebrating my birthday would turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. I had just turned 22 and was living in a small apartment complex. It was a quiet neighborhood, and I had never had any issues with my neighbors until that night. I had been out drinking with some friends and came home a little too drunk. As I stumbled towards my front door, I noticed my neighbor standing on his porch, watching me intently. I didn't think much of it at first, as I assumed he was just being a friendly neighbor. But as I got closer, he stepped off his porch and came towards me. He gave me a hug and wished me a happy birthday, and I thanked him, eager to get inside my apartment and go to bed. But he didn't seem to want to let me go. He kept insisting that we should celebrate more appropriately and have a beer together. I tried to politely decline, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. As I fumbled with my keys, pretending to look for them, I called my cousin and told him how uncomfortable I was. My cousin immediately rushed over to help me. But the neighbor was still lingering around, trying to persuade me to let him come inside. I could feel his eyes on me as I nervously waited for my cousin to arrive. Finally, my cousin pulled up in his car, and I quickly made my escape. As I got into the car, I could feel the neighbor's eyes on me, and I knew that he wasn't happy about being rejected. The next day, I woke up feeling grateful to be safe in my own home. But that feeling quickly turned to horror when I realized that something was wrong with my dogs. They were acting lethargic and seemed to be in pain. I rushed them to the vet, and the diagnosis was devastating. They had been poisoned. I couldn't believe that someone would be so petty as to harm innocent animals just because they were rejected. I knew in my gut that it was my neighbor who did it. I called the police. There was no evidence, and they couldn't prove anything. I was terrified to leave my dogs alone after that. I never knew what my neighbor was capable of. I eventually moved out of that apartment complex, but the experience left me with a sense of unease that has never completely gone away. I learned the hard way that not everyone is as they seem, and that it's important to trust your instincts, especially when it comes to your safety. Growing up, my family owned a large plot of land deep in the forests of northern Wisconsin. We spent countless summers exploring the dense woods, camping, and hunting. However, our paradise was not without its problems. One day, we discovered that the adjacent family had been hunting on our land without our permission. They had also set up motion-activated cameras around the forest to track deer. We tried to settle the matter amicably, but they refused to listen, and legal action was threatened. After a few years, the family moved away, and we thought the issue was finally resolved. However, a few months later, my dad went to check on the cabin we were building on the land, and something seemed off. He quickly realized that someone had broken in, and not only that, they had made an intricate nest out of twigs, vines, and branches on the dining table. A crow's skull and feathers were placed in the middle of the nest. We were all puzzled and disturbed by this strange occurrence. We had no idea who would break into our cabin, and create such a bizarre display. We searched the surrounding area, but there were no signs of anyone living nearby. The nearest house was miles away. As the weeks passed, strange things continued to happen. We found animal carcasses placed around the property in odd configurations, and we would sometimes hear strange noises at night. My family and I became increasingly paranoid and started taking turns saying the cabin to keep watch. One day, my sister caught a glimpse of someone in the woods near the cabin. She described him as a tall, thin man with long hair and a beard. We immediately called the police, but they were unable to find anyone matching that description. The incidents continued, and we were at a loss as to what to do. We thought about selling the land and cutting our losses, but it had been in our family for generations, and we couldn't bear the thought of losing it. Finally, one day, my dad stumbled upon a man living in a makeshift shelter on our land. It was the man my sister had seen in the woods, and he had been living there for months, unbeknownst to us. He was clearly unstable and had been the one responsible for all the strange occurrences. We immediately called the authorities, and he was taken into custody. It turned out that he had been living off the grid for years and had a history of mental illness. He had been using our land to hunt and survive and had become increasingly paranoid and unstable. It was a relief to finally have an explanation for all the strange things that had been happening on our land. We made sure to secure the property and put up signs to deter trespassers. The incident also made us more aware of the importance of mental health and the need to be vigilant when it comes to personal safety and security. In the end, we were able to continue enjoying our family land without any further issues. The strange occurrences had left us with a sense of unease, but we had overcome them, and the memories we made on that land continued to be cherished for years to come. I've always been a bit wary of the guy who asks me for a cigarette every day at the bus stop. I don't know his name, where he's from, or what he does. All I know is that he's always there, waiting for me with his hand outstretched, ready to take whatever I can spare. I don't mind giving him a cigarette every now and then, but I always feel like he's watching me, studying me, trying to figure me out. I've never seen him outside of our morning routine until tonight. I was walking home from a late shift at the bar when he jumped me from behind. I felt his arms wrap around my neck, squeezing tight, as he demanded a cigarette. At first, I thought it was just a random mother looking to make a quick buck. But then I saw his face, illuminated by the streetlights. It was the same guy from the bus stop, his eyes wild and desperate. I pushed him away from me and pulled out my pack of cigarettes. "Take it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Take it and go." He snatched the cigarette out of my hand and ran off into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath and trying to process what had just happened. Was he really that desperate for a smoke? Or was there something else going on? The next day, I saw him at the bus stop as usual. He didn't say anything to me, and I didn't say anything to him. We just stood there, smoking our cigarettes in silence. But something had changed between us. I could feel it. I knew that I couldn't just ignore what had happened the night before. I needed to find out more about this guy, figure out what was going on in his head. Over the next few days, I started watching him more closely. I followed him from the bus stop to his apartment, and I saw how he lived. It was a small, cramped space, filled with empty beer cans and discarded cigarette butts. He didn't have much, but what he did have, he treasured. I started talking to him more, asking him about his life, his dreams, his hopes. He opened up to me, telling me about his struggles with addiction, his failed relationships, and his deep sense of loneliness. I listened to him, nodding along, offering whatever comfort I could. As time went on, we became friends. We started hanging out together outside of the bus stop, going to bars, watching movies, and talking about life. I never would have thought that the guy who once jumped me from behind in the middle of the night would become one of my closest confidants. Looking back on it now, I realized that our chance encounter that night was a turning point in my life. It taught me that sometimes the people we fear the most are the ones who need our help the most. And that by reaching out to others, by listening and empathizing, and showing compassion, we can build connections that last a lifetime.